Bienvenidos a Vox Terra. Welcome back to the show's purpose. It is to get humanity to focus its politics on the long-term survival of our species. And I also am known to slip into some of my native accents on occasion. Let me start with this news headline. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and UK Defense Secretary Wallace pressure Germany to send tanks to Ukraine or open the way for Poland to do so. Citing Vox Terra. Wait a minute, you're citing Vox Terra? That's you. Yes, I am, but I'm going to cite that then to some Associated Press articles and numerous other citations. So when we think about this conflict with Russia or conflict with any nation, you want to keep in mind certain factors that might bring you towards, like I am, a more peaceful resolution of the conflict, shall we say, more willing to negotiate, less of a one-sided narrative, one that I believe is driving us towards a world of endless war. Well, factor one is always consider an economic analysis. What industries are served by conflict and what stories are being underemphasized in our media that has ties to these industries. Ditto for our history. Consider a quote from the U.S. Founding Fathers about beware of entangling alliances. A couple quotes from the Bible, look at the mote in thine own eye, and ask yourself how much is that happening with our media and our history, and blessed are the peacemakers. And always make climate change part of your analysis. A heating planet. Think about endless war on a heating planet. What kind of world do you want to live in? So just to show you the reliability of my headline, citing from the Associated Press, Germany pressed on tanks for Ukraine. Kiev airs frustration. And from that article, just partially quoting the United Kingdom Defense Secretary, the decision was a natural progression of military support for Ukraine and was discussed with the U.S. And another quoting from that article, Germany faces pressure, or at least to clear the way for Poland to deliver German Leopards from their own stock. And those Leopards are talking about tanks. The AP again, defense chief tries to resolve dispute over tanks for Ukraine. Now, first, most of my shows always involve media criticism, so just notice the passive voice of those headlines. Citing Lloyd Austin's quote, "We need to keep up our momentum and our resolve. We need to dig in even deeper." Wow, dig in even deeper. Now that may sound good to you, but I'll tell you why it doesn't to me as we go through this one. Also consider this, what I find disturbing headline, but maybe you don't, from NBC, that the U.S. is announcing the training of Ukrainian troops within the U.S. And when you think about where this is all headed, well, keep in mind this quote, this Kremlin quote, as they call it, cited in the AP. Spokesman said the deployment of Western tanks would trigger unambiguously negative consequences. Unambiguously negative consequences. Well, before we get into those economic analysis and look at the mote in thine own eye biblical analysis, let's just start with just some interesting, I think, just strange things about looking at history. And think about this with Germany versus Poland in this conflict. Well, I remember when I was a teen being involved in some brawls and the losing party to the brawl being expected then to join the victorious party in a brawl with another group of teen guys. Well, we in quotes, defeated Germany twice in 2 world wars, and now Germany is expected to start going along with us on our own military expeditions. Us in quotes again. Now consider Poland. What's really interesting here is when we launched our invasion, our in quotes again, the U.S. invaded Iraq, Poland was one of the nations that joined the coalition of the willing and went along with us on that. And that's after the Soviet Union collapsed, obviously. Well, when I heard that headline back in the time of the invasion, I thought, you know what? If I lived in the Middle East, this would feel to me like the Crusades all over again. So let's start with that economic critique. And here I just also want to highlight another famous historical quote that says, patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. And what I interpret that quote to mean is that all sorts of business interests or just financial interests can hide and wrap themselves in a patriotic cloak. So I've cited to you in the past from a website called Open Secrets that tracks campaign donations, amazingly ignored this Open Secrets by most media outlets, and shown you that both defense industry and the fossil fuel industry donate millions to American politicians. At least they track the congressional races. Now, in the case of fossil fuels, those donations are far bigger to the Republican Party, and that explains the real reason why they've resisted transitions towards renewable energy for decades, and why some Democrats also drag their heels on it. But in the case of the defense industry, those donations are almost a tie, but still slightly ahead to Republicans. Now, here at this moment, just pause for a moment and reflect on marketing campaigns or propaganda. Well, elements within the fossil fuel industry have done just an excellent job of wrapping themselves in a conservative cloak and presenting their agenda as conservative. But we could argue the defense industry can really put on a conservative or a liberal cloak depending on the need at the time. Again, showing those economic interests in the past, I've shared with you a number of times in 1997, I believe it was, New York Times article. It largely ignored, showing that after the Soviet Union broke up, and a lot of people were thinking peace would reign throughout the planet. Now everybody's capitalist, doing business. You got rich, poor people, no problem now. No more pesky public sector-oriented government any longer, or a public sector-oriented economy. It's all privatized. Well, after that, the defense industry lobbied mightily to expand NATO. Okay, think about that. They lobbied to expand NATO. And remember that underreported quote by former President Dwight D. Eisenhower about beware the influence of the military-industrial complex, warning about that revolving door between government and the defense industry. And here, really underreported, was Lloyd Austin. He himself, I believe it was Raytheon that he sat on the board of, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, connected to Raytheon, a big-time defense contractor. And I did a show prior highlighting the average annual CEO pay at those defense contractors, and as I remember, it's around $20 million a year. Well, that's a heck of a lot of incentive built in for conflict. Now, our media, why is our media downplaying these connections or de-emphasizing them? Well, you can look at an author called Noam Chomsky who focused on maybe things like interlocking boards of directors between major media outlets and defense contractors or other industries like the fossil fuel industry, the power of advertising dollars, and to show that the publication called The Intercept did a report showing how all of these different so-called defense experts coming on advising it, in this case it was a hawkish stance towards Afghanistan, that none of those cable news outlets showed their ties to the defense industry, just swept under the rug or de-emphasized. And in the background, I've heard that a lot of those contractors now are emphasizing something called great powers conflict as their new justification for purchasing their product. In the past, it was war on terror. Before, it was the war against communism. So we're beginning to see how Russia and China have been sort of forever enemies, initially vilified in our media for being so-called communist, which really, it looks to me now after the Soviet Union broke up, the real problem was they had a public sector-based economy, and a lot of people wanted to get that thing privatized. But now that both those countries have engaged in private ownership and private, ownership of the means of production, they've got those big wealth disparities just like the U.S. and the rest of us do. Well, they're still the enemy. So they were bad then, they're bad now, for decades now. And when we take a break from them being the bad guys, it's someone else being the bad guys. And I've shown you in the past also articles showing that there's been voices for peace or voices emphasizing negotiation for a lot of these conflicts. Going back to Iraq was when it first came clear to me, but those voices get underemphasized. That's why I did that show for you about Henry Kissinger's quote warning, hey, there's no real end game for these aggressive stances we're taking towards Russia and China. But here he also underemphasized in the media. But yet people who are going to get on the news or do some kind of punditry talking about the need for a tough stance and to keep arming and, more weaponry, they're going to get a lot of airplay. Well, history itself is underemphasized our role in it, or that look at the own eye, or even just how it looks to someone else. And you're not going to get to that peacemaker position unless you look at how it looks to someone else. And like I showed you in one of my videos at the outset of this invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the history untold or underreported, Russia's initial demands were that Ukraine not join NATO. And that seems to have been a big red line in the sand for them for decades now. They don't want Ukraine joining NATO, and something they were calling denazification. Now, the not joining NATO is kind of obvious how that would feel. Imagine a military alliance right on your country's border or our country's border, only gaining in strength, gaining in numbers. Nobody would want that. The denazification is a bit more of a tangled issue, how sincere that is and hypocrisy. You can go back and forth about it. But even there's some underreported truth to that. Historically, Russia has suffered two major invasions. One, the Napoleonic invasion, but then also the invasion from Nazi Germany, losing millions of people. That's why they initially, once the Soviet Union was established, wanted this nice buffer zone, it was called, around them to buffer against a future invasion. Well, even though initially, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, people like James Baker from the US seemed to be giving assurances, hey, NATO's not going to expand. Well, after that defense industry lobbying, NATO kept expanding, and the guns and missiles kept coming closer to Russia's border. That friendly buffer was gradually being eroded. But Russia seems to have drawn a red line at Ukraine for various reasons that we could dig into further, but most media isn't really doing so. Ukraine seemed pretty integrated with the Soviet Union at the time, when there was still a Soviet Union. Large portions of Ukraine have what are considered ethnically Russian population. And in 2014, when Obama was still president, there was a government that was considered an elected government that was considered more friendly towards Russia, or at least maybe less inclined to have Ukraine join the European Union. And consider that too. That's another point of conflict here. Is Ukraine going to join the European Union or not? Well, joining that union or not also has a lot to do with economic ties and economic interests. Well, there was an uprising or a coup against that government, which at the time, and I mentioned this in my video on Jeffrey Sachs, another underreported voice for negotiation, was sort of portrayed in our media, as much as it was talked about at all, as something good. As like, this was a corrupt government, blah, blah, blah. Well, you could say that about any government that's corrupt, they need a coup against them. And if you look at the photographs from that 2014 coup against that elected government, it really has some resemblance to January 6th. And that pre-coup government also was going to enact these things called the Minsk Accords, barely talked about in our media either, which as far as I understand, we're going to give more autonomy to the Russian-speaking or to the ethnically Russian areas of Ukraine. But then post-coup, that seemed to be being reneged on, is my impression. But again, barely talked about. It should be. Well, also barely emphasized was there was racialist or racist elements within that 2014 coup. And also, just after Russia's invasion, I did explore their denazification claim a bit, and to wit, indeed underemphasized, but there are articles about what are called foreign fighters, racist foreign fighters, going into Ukraine to join the fight against Russia. And there was a lot of articles about there's something called the Azov Battalion, and them also that Azov Battalion also having a lot of ties to neo-Nazis or that type of racist thing. Going back further, during World War II, pretty much all occupied nations had some element of collaborators or people who collaborated with the Nazis. Maybe were somewhat sympathetic to their worldview or thought they were. Well, this was also the case in Ukraine. And according to an article I found in Common Dreams, which sounds pretty plausible to me, and I think it will to you too, you know that Reagan was instrumental in really hyping up or strengthening that Cold War against the Soviet Union, really wanting to break them up. Well, part of that always involves what people call propaganda. Part of that propaganda came from something called Radio Liberty, and according to this Common Dreams article, broadcasting the talks of Ukrainian ethnic nationalists, or right-wingers as they call them. But I want to, stop a little bit here and question the definition of right-wing, left-wing, get people out of that, black and white thinking a bit. But Common Dreams is calling them right-wing Ukrainian exiles, who, according to the article, were praising some of the Ukrainians who were Nazi collaborators. Not my quote, but it all sounds plausible based on what I know of history, those underreported histories. And as far as these coups and these, fomenting ethnic nationalism within the Soviet Union to break it up, well, a lot of these things only come out years and years later as declassified documents, and then because they're old history, they're ignored, and they're not really history that anybody's eager to put forward. They don't really serve any economic agenda, established economic agenda, that is. So my point in this one is if you think you're liberal and you're supporting just keep arming Ukraine and not negotiating with Russia out of your liberal sentiments, you may not really know what you're signing up for. Remember that defense industry can market itself to liberal causes as well. Think about the invasions of Afghanistan, even Iraq, which was totally muddled. Now our conflict with Iran, it's generally sold here as we're defending women's rights, a more considered a liberal cause. And go back to that founding fathers warning about entangling alliances. If you know people, immigrants like I do, if you had a lot of interaction with newcomers to the country, you may pick up on some really intense ethnic rivalries that many of us really don't understand and don't understand what we're sticking our noses in the middle of. Now, if you consider yourself liberal too, you may think about these billions of dollars going to Ukraine and to defend, to arm them. Well, that's billions of dollars not just to the Ukrainians, it's billions of dollars to the defense industry. Economic interest, fossil fuel industry. Well, this war, this conflict has been used as a big justification to start building new fossil fuel infrastructure. Germany's trying to use it as an excuse to start digging a hole again. There's been a lot of talk or expansion of the U.S. liquefied natural gas and fracking and that kind of thing, all justified as, well, it's temporary till we get to that green economy. But you know what? That's how they sell it to you. It usually doesn't work out like that. When these industries get more wealth and more money, they get more power and more influence in the media. And in the case of fossil fuels, there's always going to be some excuse to justify burning them and digging up more of them and continuing our reliance on them. And you know what? Maybe this war will work out like you're hoping. There'll just be this tough stance towards Russia, keep arming Ukraine, and there's something called a victory. Never mind how the people in the ethnically Russian areas feel about that, or how people maybe who for whatever reasons had sympathy with Russia, we don't know why, we're not there. And this works out like you're imagining. Now, does that set a good precedent? Just no negotiation? That's the kind of world you want to live in? We can out-arm them, outgun them, and we win. That was the mindset that got us into invading Iraq, in my opinion. George W. Bush said we don't need no permission slip from the UN. And as far as I can tell, if we do succeed in this one, there's not going to be, it won't be like world peace breaks out and now we're going to fund the Green New Deal. It never seems to work like that. There'll be another conflict, yet have another excuse for the burning of fossil fuels and an even bigger defense industry. And all of our dreams and hopes like healthcare for all ignored again. But I'm skeptical it will work out well because I haven't seen even where it is so-called victory, like we had a so-called victory in Iraq, we had a so-called victory in Libya, fought Syria to a stalemate. All those countries are in chaos now. Generally what I see where we think we're winning, it turns out to be chaos. It's not good for us. And it's not good for the defeated nation or the defeated government, or as the media loves to say, the defeated regime. And by the way, note that word regime. It's almost like Pavlovian. They're going to toss out the word regime, and then you react, oh, it's a regime. So my conclusion is, you know what? Support something like a more robust United Nations. Criticize them, fine. Support international treaties. Criticize the treaties, fine. But support them. We can't just go on might makes right while the planet is in the process of heating up and destabilizing. Heating and destabilizing set in motion by the excessive burning of fossil fuels, but also de-emphasized by our media, the same as our media de-emphasizes all these points and all these voices that would give you pause to support these just one-sided, no negotiation, keep on to topple the so-called enemy stances. And if you still think I'm wrong, this could be the 1850s as far as I'm concerned. And I'd be arguing, you know what, we in the US, we should be having treaties with the natives. And you'd be listening to the media at the time and saying, you know what, Vox Terra, do you know what they did to that pioneer family? How could you say that? It'd be the same thing then as now. Well, hey, I hope you found this video helpful, informative. Let me know what you think about it, your comments. We could critique and maybe go back and forth a bit. Sincere constructive criticism is always welcome and really useful. You know, just let me know what's working for you, what isn't working for you. And as always, thank you to my 2 patrons of Patreon. It helps keep the morale going. And if you could join them and also donate, that could help make this show sustainable for me. There's a heck of a lot of work. A lot of time goes into it, a lot of research, a lot of what economists call opportunity cost, missed opportunities. And personally, I think this show, what I'm trying to do here, is a valuable service. So thank you, Bella Grissi, Environmental Coffee House. Thank you to everyone who subscribed. If you can subscribe, you can also help get me up to that 1,000 subscriber mark. And then maybe I can eventually get a little compensation for the commercials YouTube puts up here that they don't compensate this show for. Click that notification bell, when I'm putting up a new video. And as always, hey, until next time, peace be with you.